I thought if you're going to join the Army, you should join the Army to do the hardest job that you can. Those veterans that came home from Vietnam, was on their backs that our nation healed and continued to fight the Cold War successfully. And then they had to rebuild the Army such that we could live through the peace dividend of the 90s and be prepared for what occurred on 9/11. They did that.
Listen.
How would you measure someone spending 3 decades of their life all in service to something bigger than themselves?
19 March 2003, I was sitting on the border between Kuwait and Iraq as a captain and a member of the 3rd Infantry Division, and we were watching missiles get slung overhead, knocked out of the sky by our patriots, and preparing to invade Iraq.
He experienced things that for most of us only exist in our dreams.
101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions. I was honored to be selected to be a part of the group that would go jump into Normandy again for the 70th anniversary.
Colonel Martin Jeremy Bowling just retired from the Army a few weeks ago.
The thing that I can tell you that sticks out the most to me is how well prepared we were.
A few years ago, he found a new interest, returning combat veterans and family members back to the battlefields that changed their lives forever. Today on the show, I talked to Colonel Bowling about all of it. My name is Josh Rowe, and this is Tomorrowtown, Tennessee.
Go by my middle name, which is Jeremy, but born and raised in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Spent my childhood out riding bikes through the woods and running the roads of East Brainerd. Started off at Tyner Middle School and then moved over to the Baylor School, which is where I graduated high school in 1994.
How'd you end up in the Army? How'd that work?
It's a bit of a long story. The short version of it is I went to Baylor on a scholarship, and part of the stipulations of the scholarship was I had to immediately matriculate into a 4-year university and maintain a certain GPA. I chose Auburn University to do that, and I was paying my way through school as a freshman and working for minimum wage as a dishwasher at a local mom and pop restaurant. And I came home one night kind of halfway through my freshman year, covered in grease and dirt and sweat, the normal things that come along with a job like that. And there was a message on my answering machine, and it was the local Army recruiter there in Auburn, Alabama. He said I was exactly the kind of guy they were looking for. So I called him the next day, and the rest is history. I went through their tests and wrote some essays and got some recommendations, and they offered me a full scholarship to complete my time at Auburn University, and I signed the dotted line.
How did they find you? If they knew you're the right kind of guy, how do they determine that?
Because he was a recruiter. That's what recruiters get paid to do.
Exactly.
It was to find young men like me that are willing to go out there and do the things they need us to do. And he was good at his job. His name was Major Mejias. And I'm glad he found me. I wouldn't change it.
Yeah, I think that's a sentiment I hear from a lot of veterans. I guess you're a veteran now officially, right?
Sure.
As of 2 weeks ago, last week?
About a week and a half ago.
About a week and a half ago. Right, it's hard, but it's that good kind of hard, kind of hard that challenges you and pushes you to discover things about yourself. Can you kind of explain that experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's why I was there. Someone was actually just asking me yesterday to reflect back on the male figureheads that influenced me as a young person, and it was all my coaches at Baylor. Ralph Potter, who the Chattanooga community now knows as the Macaulay football coach, but guys like him, Perry Key, Fred Hubbs, Phil Hibden, I mean, the list goes on and on. Those guys in the 90s ran a very tight ship at Baylor, and it was very physically, emotionally, and mentally challenging. And what they were doing is they were forging a group of young people that were going to launch out into the world with a level of personal mettle that I don't think at the time we had an appreciation for. But once I found the Army, which was really a natural fit for me because of those things, what I realized is that because I had spent so much of my youth rising to those challenges, I missed it. It was a part of who I was. And the Army gave me that ability to do that again. And I actually went into the Army initially intending to be a doctor. I was a pre-med student at Auburn. And I remember my brother, who's a couple years older than me, he gave me advice. He said, Jeremy, he was already in the Army. He said, Jeremy, when you get there, stay focused on your goal. Don't fall for all the hardcore stuff. Stay focused on your goal. And I hate to break it to your brother, I did not take your advice. But it's because that's where I belong, right? That's where I fit in best. And it became pretty evident to me pretty early on. And so I thought, if you're going to join the Army, you should join the Army to do the hardest job that you can. And that's what I did.
And what was the job you ended up doing?
Up until 10 days ago, I was an Army infantry colonel, airborne ranger kind of guy. Spent most of my time in the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions. And you know what we've all been doing since 9/11, 2001. It's been a fairly busy career, to say the least.
Tell me about some of that. And I understand there's probably stuff you don't want to talk about, but what was that experience like to, I'm not a combat vet, but when I do talk to combat vets, it's one of those things of it's sometimes hard to put in words. And sometimes people have the exact, words for it. When you think about the hard things, the things you went through, how do you think about it?
Yeah, I don't think about it in terms of how hard it was or wasn't. I guess in reality, I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about it. I haven't had a chance to do a lot of that yet. But if you ask me to reflect on it, the thing that I can tell you that sticks out the most to me is how well prepared we were. And that's one of the things that sets the United States Department of Defense and the U.S. Army apart from so many other nations. And we have great partners and allies all around the world, no doubt. And I've worked with many of them in many places around the world. But what sets us apart is our preparation to do the things that we're asked to do. And so in 2003, actually it was 19 March 2003, which for the record was supposed to be the day that my initial term of service ended. I was sitting on the border between Kuwait and Iraq as a captain and a member of the 3rd Infantry Division, and we were watching missiles get slung overhead, knocked out of the sky by our patriots, and preparing to invade Iraq. And there was never a moment of hesitation, not just to me, but everyone else in my battalion and brigade and division, because you knew how well trained you were, so you didn't stop to think about those other things. You were laser focused on the mission, just like everyone else, and you went and did it. And when they told you to go home, you went home and you prepared for the next one, and the next one, and the next one. And that's how the next 25 years went for me, but for all of us, frankly.
Yeah, I think when people who haven't done it, including myself, you think about it and you think about, boy, that's been hard. I think it's like a lot of hard things in life, in some ways anyway, like you just mentioned. If you focus on the process, like not the entirety of it.
That's right.
I got to do this thing next.
Sure.
It does have a different feel to it. When you really think about that. Is that kind of like when you go in, you're just worried about the details, the job, the mission, that kind of thing?
Yeah, you are. And it's repetition also comes to play. I have a saying that I like to use: if you want to get better at doing push-ups, do more push-ups. But that's frankly applicable to everything in life, right? It just comes through repetition, whether you're an athlete, an academic, a physician, or a soldier. Through repetition, you inevitably become more proficient, more efficient, and an expert eventually. And that's how the Army goes on all sides. Whether you're a war fighter or you're supporting the war fighter, you do repetition after repetition. And by a certain point, you don't have to think about it. It just becomes natural. And that's the level of expertise that we're always working on in the Army. Now, look, we're not perfect. That sometimes, like Rumsfeld said back in the day, you go to war with the Army you got, and we have that. But what we've also got in those scenarios is this, right? When you look down at your shoulder and you see that flag and these young people raise their right hand, they know that they're assuming risk, and they're happy and honored to do it because they understand what the United States represents and what that uniform that they're wearing represents, and they're proud to be a part of it.
Yeah. So let's talk about what brings you here today, and I think to start with that, being in the 101st and the 82nd, you have to have a sense of history to really appreciate what that really means. Has that always been with you as far as the sense of history part?
Yes and no. What I mean by yes is, as a professional, and we're certainly expected to be that, you are taught at a very early age to have a appreciation for military history. You study history so you're not destined to repeat it, but you also study because there's lessons to be learned from it. So yes, I had that appreciation. But I will tell you what was really a watershed moment for me was in 2014, while I was serving in the 82nd Airborne Division. It was also the 70th anniversary of D-Day. And I was honored to be selected. I was a young major. I was honored to be selected to be a part of the group along with the division commander, Major General John Nicholson, that would go jump into Normandy again for the 70th anniversary. And we did that, and as you might imagine, it was the most incredible experience of a young officer's life. And I spent that week interacting with World War II veterans, guys like Rock Merritt, who had spent significant time on the ground. And what that gave me in 2014 was a level of appreciation for not just for history, but the importance of that history to the individuals that lived it. And I never forgot that. I mean, I'm sitting on the stairs of a church eating fried chicken in Normandy, France, with a group of guys who had used that same building 70 years earlier as their headquarters from which they were fighting. And we're sitting there swapping stories. And I, on my wife's side, my wife is an Army brat, her grandfather had jumped into D-Day, also with the 82nd. And on that day that I jumped in 2014, I actually had, we call it a family heirloom. It was a money clip, probably not worth more than a dime, but he had jumped with it in his pocket on D-Day. And he had carried it with him through the rest of World War II, through the Korean War, and then he'd given it to his son-in-law who carried it through 2 tours in Vietnam, and then he had given it to me when I married his daughter years later, and I had at that point had carried it on 4 different combat deployments. And I jumped it back into Normandy in 2014. And as I sat there on the steps of those men at that church and told them the story, they knew who I was talking. They knew him. His name was Don Burke. And so that connection was now with me on a very different level. And they started telling stories about that and about their organization. But I never forgot how powerful that was. And years later, in 2017, when I was given the honor to command again in the 101st Airborne Division, it was with the 3rd Battalion of 187th Infantry. That's the organization that had fought the Battle of Hamburger Hill in May of '69. And I said, coming into that command in 2017, these veterans, these gentlemen deserve the same level of honor and remembrance and commemoration that I had seen the World War II veterans getting in 2014. And, as you know, it was different for the Vietnam vets when they came home, and not in a good way. And I had gotten to know these guys over the course of my time in the Army, and I have family members who are Vietnam vets, and I understood the pain that they had dealt with over those years. So I said, I'm going to change that. I'm going to give these Vietnam veterans a chance to make peace with what they did on behalf of their nation when they've never been given that chance. So in the first year of my command, I announced that we would be going back to Vietnam to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Hamburger Hill. And I certainly didn't realize it at the time how that would become a part of my life forever and ever, and it has, and I'm very grateful for it. So we spent the better part of 2 years coordinating with the U.S. Embassy and the government of Vietnam to put together this event. And we ended up taking a group of, I think it was about 25 veterans and family members and some of my active duty soldiers back to Vietnam in May of 2019 to commemorate the 50th anniversary. And we were even able to find some of the North Vietnamese Army veterans who had fought in that same battle against my veterans. And we essentially spent the week together, and by the end of the week, we climbed back to the top of Hamburger Hill and just gave my veterans an opportunity to make peace with the demons that they had been carrying for 50 years. Each of them brought some sort of memento that they wanted to leave on the hill, because all of these veterans, except for 1 or 2, had never seen the top of the hill because they were all evac'd. And it was an 11-day fight, and they were all evac'd at some point in that 11-day fight. So they felt this pull their whole lives to just see what was on top of that hill. Why were we trying to get there? And we finally gave it to them in 2019. And standing on top of that hill, one of my veterans leaned over to me. It was, as you might imagine, a very reverent time and quiet. And he said, "Sir, I always heard that guys got awards for this thing, but I got medevaced. I never got anything. I always wondered if I got an award that I didn't know of." And I I looked at him standing there on top of the hill, and I said, well, I didn't know that either. I said, but I'll solve that problem for you. And so when we came home from that, this is where it just continued. I then did that piece of the puzzle, and I worked with Human Resources Command and U.S. Army, doing some research in the archives there in D.C. I was in the Pentagon at the time, and we found out that not only did he have awards, he had a whole bunch of awards, to include Bronze Stars and Purple Hearts. So I then coordinated with the governor's office out of South Carolina, and we put together a big ceremony with the governor on the front steps of the State House, and we presented Mr. Green with all his awards, and that was in 2021. And then we identified another veteran who had a similar need, and we did the same thing. We just did a big presentation in DeSoto, Texas last year to give him all of his awards, and he had even more awards. And since then, I've had more veterans come forth and more veterans come forth looking for the same thing, and I can't not give it to them, right? And that's how I got involved with this organization, with John Hollis. He was at a dinner party some months ago, and he was talking about Sergeant Rodney Davis and his actions where he received the Medal of Honor, and John wanted to bring the family back to Vietnam to give them a chance to get some closure and see where Sergeant Davis had performed his heroic actions. And he heard about me and the things that my friends and organizations had done with the Hamburger Hill veterans. And some retired senior Army flag officers told John, you got to call Colonel Bowling, because he's been doing this for a few years now. And just out of the blue, I got a cold call, and John Hollis and Major Chuck Casey, who was working in the embassy at the time in Vietnam when I went back in 2019, along with historian Eric Villard from the Center for Military History, we've just started this informal organization where when we have an opportunity to give back to Vietnam era veterans and their families, we do it. And that's how I'm sitting here today, because we're going to go forward and do that again this August and September on behalf of Sergeant Rodney Davis, but it's for his family and also for some of the family members of the Marines that survived as a result of his actions.
I was reading a book that Jim Stockdale wrote. Stockdale, Medal of Honor recipient, POW for 7.5 years. And he was, obviously he ran for vice president. And he was talking about something that President H.W. Bush said about putting the Vietnam War behind you. And he said, I'll never put it behind me. And he said, that's until our generation is here, as long as we're here, we're never going to put it behind us. And I look at that a little bit of kind of what I do in some way of like, yeah, let's not forget. Let's keep talking about it, because there's so much that's never that they never got to say because they weren't allowed to say it. Either they didn't make it home or they did come home, couldn't say it. And so what you're doing is, in a lot of ways, is connecting some of those dots, making sure these stories, live on.
They deserve it as much as a World War I, a World War II, Korean War veteran. And I love the term, I believe it was Tom Brokaw that coined the term greatest generation. And I don't dispute that was an accurate term for that generation, but that wasn't the last greatest generation. I can promise you that. And my generation was very much influenced by the Vietnam veteran generation. I mean, my first sergeant that I had in the Army in the 90s was one of the last remaining draftees still on active duty from Vietnam. And of course, that gentleman made a huge impression on me. But the Vietnam War, you will never put it behind us, because those veterans that came home from Vietnam, whether they decided to continue to serve in uniform or in some other capacity, was on their backs that our nation healed and continued to fight the Cold War successfully. And then they had to rebuild the Army such that we could live through the peace dividend of the 90s and be prepared for what occurred on 9/11. They did that. And so they were also a great generation. And if I can be a small part of making sure that they know that and I can give back to them in some small way, I'm honored to do it, and I will forever do it.
I had a coach that I played for a few years in high school, and I didn't know until about a decade ago that he fought in Vietnam. He was a little bit older than you, it was early 90s, and he never talked about military service, none of that stuff. He never spoke about it back then, but now, he's writing on Facebook about it. And so I think that's an experience that Yeah, it took a long time for those guys, even when they
Absolutely.
felt like they could talk about it, they just still didn't want to talk about it.
Yeah, when we presented the awards to James Baylor, that was my veteran, this past November in DeSoto, Texas, I had more of his family members there than I can count. And to a man or woman, they all said they had no idea. He had never shared with them some of those stories. And when we pinned those awards on his chest, and it was a lot, it took a long time to pin all those awards, they just sat in awe, because this is a father, a brother, a husband, and they listened to him talk about it for the first time. And at that point, it had been more than 50 years. They just had no idea. I mean, a highly decorated veteran who had spent his life not talking about it. And he's a fabulous contributing member of society, came back and spent his life as a law enforcement officer in multiple communities in multiple states, and retired working for a university there in Texas, and never told anybody about it, that he had seen and done and witnessed and survived and contributed to things that earned him more than a chest full of medals. And to me, that's great. That's greatness personified right there. He didn't have to talk about it. Whether he chose to or not, that's not the point. The point is he didn't have to talk about it. He knew it. His friends, his fellow soldiers in those foxholes, they knew. And that's what mattered.
Tell me what the story of Rodney Maxwell Davis, what that means to you. I mean, what he didn't even know some of those men that lives he saved. It really is, it's amazing that anyone would have the ability to do something like that.
Yeah, so first off, phenomenal story. Just most people cannot fathom making the personal decision to take that action that Sergeant Davis did. But what I can tell you is, having spent a career as an infantryman, I'm not surprised. And what I mean by that is, that's what soldiers, that's what Marines, that's what sailors, that's what airmen, that's what they do. That's what makes the United States different from so many others, is that we have young men and women of all backgrounds, of all race, color, creed, it doesn't matter. When they put on that uniform and they put that flag on their shoulder, they're an American Marine, they're an American soldier. And I've seen it, absolutely seen it firsthand. And when I took my veterans back to Vietnam in 2019, many of which were from minority backgrounds, and we would ask them some of those questions, they would just laugh, and they said, there was no color in that foxhole. You were just a soldier. That soldier to your left and right, he was just a soldier. You didn't care anything about, other than the fact, was he going to do his job? And you knew that he would. And sure, I wasn't there with Sergeant Davis, but I guarantee you that's exactly how it was. It didn't matter that Sergeant Davis came from Georgia. It didn't matter that he was an African American. And it didn't matter to him that the Marines to his left and right weren't those things. What mattered is that they were all Marines, all from the same platoon, the same company, the same regiment, fighting the same enemy. And their job was to look forward and take care of business. And when that grenade rolled into the foxhole, I guarantee Davis didn't think twice. He did what he had to do, because that's what we're trained to do. That's what makes us unique.
A big thank you to retired Colonel Martin J. Bowling for this conversation on Tomorrowtown, Tennessee. This podcast, a production of News Channel 9, Fox Chattanooga, and Sinclair Broadcast Group Chattanooga. I hope you join me again real soon.